In December 1991, one of the most powerful states in modern history disappeared. The Soviet Union, a nuclear superpower that controlled half of Europe, had defeated Nazi Germany, challenged the United States for global leadership, and ruled nearly 290 million people. Yet it was not destroyed by foreign invasion. It collapsed from within. The Soviet Union emerged from the Russian Revolution of 1917. After Civil War, the USSR was officially created in 1922. Under Lenin, the new state consolidated power. Under Stalin, it industrialized at extreme human cost through forced collectivization, purges, repression, and terror. Millions died, but the Soviet Union became a massive military-industrial state. After the Second World War, it rose as one of the world's two superpowers. It dominated Eastern Europe, built nuclear weapons, launched Sputnik, sent the first human into space, and competed with the United States throughout the Cold War. But behind the image of strength, the system was hardening. By the Brezhnev era, the Soviet Union looked stable on the surface, but was growing weaker underneath. Its economy was slowing, corruption was spreading, and its political system had become too rigid to adapt. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he tried to save the Soviet system. Instead, he exposed how fragile it had become. The Soviet collapse cannot be understood without its economic crisis. Central planning had once helped the state industrialize quickly, build heavy industry, and mobilize for war. But it was far less effective at running a modern economy based on efficiency, innovation, and consumer demand. By the 1970s, the system was stagnating. Factories were judged by output targets, not quality. Managers focused on meeting quotas, even if the goods were defective or unnecessary. Innovation was slow because bureaucrats feared failure more than inefficiency. Agriculture was a chronic embarrassment. Despite its huge territory and resources, the Soviet Union still had to import grain. Daily life was defined by shortages, long lines, poor quality goods, and empty shelves. At the same time, the USSR carried an enormous military burden. It was spending heavily to keep up with the United States in nuclear weapons, missiles, conventional forces, and advanced defense technology. That burden became harder to carry as growth weakened. Then oil prices fell in the 1980s. This mattered because Soviet hard currency income depended heavily on energy exports. Lower oil revenue meant less money to import technology, support allies, and stabilize the domestic economy. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union remained militarily powerful, but it was no longer economically dynamic enough to support its global role. Economic weakness became fatal because the political system was built to hide problems, not solve them. The Soviet Union was a one-party state ruled by the Communist Party. Real opposition did not exist, independent media did not exist, and criticism was dangerous. This created order, but it also created blindness. There was also a deep legitimacy crisis. In earlier decades, the Soviet leadership could appeal to revolutionary ideals, industrial progress, and victory in the Second World War. By the 1980s, those sources of legitimacy were fading. Many citizens no longer believed the official language about socialism's superiority. They could compare the promises of the state with the reality of shortages, censorship, and stagnation. Nationalism was another buried problem. The Soviet Union called itself a union of republics, but in reality it was held together by central power. In the Baltic republics, the Caucasus, Ukraine, and Central Asia, national identities had never disappeared. They had been controlled and suppressed but not erased. As soon as the center weakened, those identities returned as political forces. Two major crises accelerated the decline by exposing the weakness of the system. The first was Afghanistan. The Soviet invasion began in 1979 and turned into a long, costly war. It drained resources, damaged morale, and exposed the limits of Soviet military power. Thousands of Soviet soldiers died in a conflict many citizens neither understood nor supported. Afghanistan became a symbol of imperial overreach and strategic exhaustion. The second shock was Chernobyl in 1986. The nuclear disaster was catastrophic in itself, but politically it was even more damaging. It revealed how dangerous the Soviet culture of secrecy had become. The government responded slowly, tried to hide the scale of the disaster, and undermined public trust in the process. If the state could not be honest about radiation, health, and basic safety, why should citizens trust it about anything else? When Gorbachev took power in 1985, he understood that the Soviet Union could not continue unchanged. His answer was reform. Perestroika aimed to restructure the economy. Glasnost aimed to open public discussion. Glasnost was even more explosive. It allowed wider criticism, freer debate, and more access to information. Gorbachev hoped openness would expose corruption and strengthen reform. Instead, it released decades of buried anger. Citizens began openly discussing Stalin's terror, economic failure, official lies, environmental damage, and ethnic injustice. Once people were allowed to question the system, many did not stop at criticizing individual officials. They began questioning the entire structure of Soviet rule. This was the great paradox of Gorbachev. He wanted to save the system by loosening it. Instead, he removed the fear and silence that had held it together. The Soviet crisis was not only domestic, it was also imperial. Moscow controlled Eastern Europe through force and political pressure. In 1989, that order collapsed. Communist governments fell in Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania. The Berlin Wall fell. Most importantly, Gorbachev refused to send Soviet troops to reverse the process. That decision was historically significant, but it also transformed the logic inside the Soviet Union. If Moscow would no longer use force to keep Eastern Europe under control, then the Soviet republics themselves could begin asking why they had to remain under Moscow's rule. This was particularly concentrated in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. These countries were independent before the Soviet annexation. National movements grew stronger across the Union. Ethnic tensions rose in the Caucasus and elsewhere. At the same time, Boris Yeltsin emerged inside Russia itself as Gorbachev's most dangerous rival. He positioned himself as the defender of Russian sovereignty against a failing Union center. Once Russia, the core republic, began asserting its own power, the Union was in real danger. By 1991, the Soviet Union was in open crisis. The economy was deteriorating. Shelves were empty. Republics were declaring sovereignty. Gorbachev was trying to preserve the Union through a new treaty that would decentralize power while keeping the state alive. Hardliners inside the leadership saw this as surrender. In August 1991, while Gorbachev was in Crimea, senior officials launched a coup. They detained him, declared a state of emergency, and tried to restore tighter control. But the coup failed within days. Its failure was decisive. Boris Yeltsin became the central figure of resistance, famously standing on a tank outside the Russian parliament building in Moscow. Parts of the military refused to back the coup. The old Soviet center lost what little authority it still had. After that, the Communist Party was politically finished. One republic after another moved toward independence. Ukraine's decision was especially important. Without Ukraine, the Soviet Union could not survive as a serious state. In December 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met and declared that the Soviet Union no longer existed. They created the Commonwealth of Independent States. On December 25th, Gorbachev resigned. The Soviet flag came down over the Kremlin. The next day, the USSR was formally dissolved. The collapse of the Soviet Union changed the world immediately. 15 independent states emerged. The United States became the only superpower. The Cold War ended. In the West, many saw this as the final victory of liberal democracy and market capitalism. But in the former Soviet world, the aftermath was harsh. Russia inherited the Soviet nuclear arsenal and the UN Security Council seat, but also economic chaos, institutional collapse, and a profound identity crisis. The 1990s in Russia brought hyperinflation, falling living standards, oligarchic privatization, and a widespread sense of humiliation. Other republics followed very different paths. The Baltic states moved toward Europe and eventually joined NATO and the European Union. Others faced war, separatism, authoritarianism, or chronic instability. The Soviet collapse did not create one post-Soviet future. It created many. Its legacy still shapes the present. NATO expansion, the independence of Ukraine, conflicts in the Caucasus and Moldova, and Russia's effort to recover influence all trace back in part to 1991. So why did the Soviet Union collapse? Because an aging empire built on central control, economic rigidity, political repression, and managed silence lost the ability to adapt. Once its economy weakened, Its ideology faded. Its republics demanded more freedom, and fear no longer held the system together. Collapse became possible. What makes 1991 so extraordinary is not only that a superpower fell, but how fast it fell once its internal supports began to fail at the same time.